Hello today. So today we're going to be covering Precise Node, which is a mod that I consider sort of core to KSP. This is a mod that I often use in my streaming, and one of the most common questions I get is, hey, how did you do that? Now the mod itself has a bunch of hotkeys, and it's one of the mods that makes it very easy to set up encounters with planets, as well as to make sure that you can get a rendezvous with another craft, or make sure that you can change the orbit or get the orbit you exactly want. So with that covered, let's get into what the mod does and how it actually works. So here we go. Okay, so here we are in sandbox mode, and the very first thing I want to cover for Precise Node is, if you are playing in career mode, you need to know that you have to have both the tracking center and the mission control upgraded at least one level before you can use patched conics. Until you can use patched conics, you cannot use Precise Node. Simple enough. If you can't see the path and you can't set new maneuver nodes, which is what that requires, then obviously setting Precise Node shouldn't be allowed either. So, the mod requires that if you are in career mode, that you have upgraded the tracking center and the mission control one level. So be aware of that before you try to use this mod. If you're using it in sandbox mode, you don't need to worry about that, but it's something to pay attention to. Okay. So here we have a craft in a simple orbit. You can see that we have a periapse of 113, an apoapse of 204, and our craft is traveling around quite nicely. It's a very simplistic craft. It's a Mark I capsule, a FLT 400 fuel tank, the Terrier, and some batteries and some solar panels, and that's about it. So, in order to use Precise Node, we can simply click anywhere on our orbit and click Add Maneuver. Instantly Precise Node will appear. You can actually close and open Precise Node by hitting the P key, and it will vanish and reappear. Now you may notice immediately that there are some additional buttons here that you may not have on yours by default. By clicking on the O key, or the O up here for options, you will get additional options. So for example here, one of the things I've done is I've clicked on Show Additional UT Controls. By doing that, you actually add periapsis descending node plus and minus 1000 ascending node and apoapse. This becomes very handy if you want to actually snap your node to a specific point. The reason you might do that is if you're trying to match up the inclination of an arc, or if you want to try to circularize your orbit to a bit better of a level. So in this case, we're going to try to circularize our orbit, and our apoapse is significantly higher than our periapse. What we'll do is we'll click on Apo, and poof, that snaps our maneuver node to exactly where our apoapse is. The next thing you need to do is decide how much you want your increments to go up and what you want to change. Many people think that that you have to type in numbers here. You do not. There are a bunch of hotkeys that come with Precise Node, and these hotkeys are rather important. For prograde, the plus and minus on the keypad is 8 and 5. For normal, the plus and minus on the keypad are 9 and 7, and for radial, the plus and minus is 6 and 4, and for time increments, it's 3 and 1, and to actually change your increment through the cycle of increments, you can actually use on your number pad just the 0 key, and it will change what it is, or you can click on it, just like that. Now you can actually click here, and right and left click to increase and decrease it as well. So that's another way you can approach this. In this case, we're going to try to raise our periapse, and since I know that our periapse probably needs to be raised by increments of 10 to begin with, I'll just set it to 10, and then I'm going to hit the 8 key to increase the amount of prograde we would burn at our apoapse. So you can see one increment of 10 raised it by 13 kilometers. There's another raise, and you can just sort of tap that until we're at 204 there. Now we're at 213, and so I would just change our increment to 1, and then I would hit the 5 key to bring that down a little bit. Now one of the things that you'll notice is that the The maneuver node sometimes slips a little bit, and you may have to click on the apoapse button again to snap it back into place on where it needs to be. I've noticed this is sort of a rounding error, if you will. You can take it all the way down to 0.01 to be really fine in your precision, but I found that usually that means that the craft is not quite as precise in its actual burning, even if you're using something like the orbital controls over here. Make sure you've got the right burn. You can also pull this up to see what the actual amount is. The reason this is relevant is because even if you've got 64 in prograde and 100 in normal, for example, the actual amount of delta V to get that combination may actually be less than adding those two numbers together, because you're basically taking the best angle to get that result. So in this case, let's just take care of this burn. So since I'm playing in sandbox mode, I can just get us to point over to our maneuver node. Pretty simplistic there. And we can just do a little time acceleration until we get over to our node. And we'll just do a little bit of a burn here. And there we go, our eccentricity is 0.000001, which means we're about as close to a perfectly circular orbit as you're going to get. As soon as I kill the node, precise node vanishes. So if you have no node, you're not going to see precise node. That's an important thing to remember. So let's give an example here. We certainly have enough delta V to do this. If we click on the moon and click set as target, and we find a place to do a node, we simply add maneuver node. And then we can click on 100 because we know it's going to take at least a couple hundred delta V to get us to get an encounter with the moon. In this case, we're far enough out in our orbit that we're going to want to do about 770. Now, at this point, you can see we've got an encounter with the moon, and we could go over and take a look at that encounter. Now, rather than having to try to tug on arrows over here, I can adjust our exact burn by simply clicking here. Now what I did there was I hit the 1 key and that changed our time increment rather than the amount of delta V. So I can actually adjust our encounter by adjusting the time of the burn and then saving on delta V. So for example, I could actually reduce the amount of delta V we're going to use, but optimize our time to the burn. And so I've actually reduced our delta V, but given ourselves a very similar encounter. So for 768 delta V, I can get that. The other thing that makes this really handy is, for example, if you're encountering Minmus, which is at an inclination to the main plane of the rotation around Kerbin's orbit, you can actually change your normal and radial by just doing the 4 and 5 or 7 and 9 keys. Now that can be very useful if you're trying to, for example, come in at a polar orbit, although usually your best bet is to get your encounter and then make the adjustments. Now at this point I don't want that to be 18 or 19, so I can actually highlight it and actually hit 0 and it will immediately change it back to 0. There's nothing to prevent you from actually typing in numbers here rather than using the hotkeys to change it. This gives you the flexibility. What I've just done there is I'm changing our time increment rather than our delta V again. So by being able to do these kinds of things, it lets you really optimize an encounter with the moon or any other object that you may have in the sky. The big important thing here is to know that the hotkeys are 8 and 5 for prograde on increase and decrease, 7 and 9 for increasing and decreasing normal, and 4 and 6 for increasing and decreasing radial, and 1 and 3 for increasing and decreasing for time increments. Now again, you can also make these changes by right and left clicking on the plus and minus here, and you can cycle through your increments by either hitting 0 to cycle through your increments, or you can actually click on the increment level that you want. Another thing that you can do is you can actually cycle through which conics you're going to sample, and you can actually manually input information from the transfer window planner into here so that you can get your exact transfer window set up by setting up the exact time and all of that exactly into the maneuver node, and then saving it, and then doing a Kerbal alarm clock for it, and poof, you've got yourself set up for a transfer window on a craft that's sitting in orbit. Makes things a little bit easier for everyone. So that's really the key to Precise Node. It may sound like it's a complicated mod, and you'll find that you need to kind of get a handle on the tweaking of it back and forth, but the important things to know are the keys for using in the number pad to just modify it without even looking at the tugs here or anything like that, or having to type in manually. For example, the last thing I would want to do is try to go, okay, 778 didn't work, let's delete that and try 776, let's delete that and try 770, let's delete that and try 780. You know, that's just not what we want to do. We want to be able to just sort of tap keys, you know, and just sort of make little changes bit by bit, or even really big changes bit by bit. So that's a very important thing, and you can actually use this to set up multiple nodes at once. So let's zero this out, and right now we have an encounter here, and so if I click here and add another maneuver node, we can actually use these arrows up here at the top to go to the next maneuver node, and we can actually set up our second maneuver. And you can see we've actually got there another maneuver node for circularization. That. So now I know that the amount of delta V that's going to be required at this is 300. The amount of delta V at the first node is going to be 781, which means my total delta V is going to be 1081 to circularize around the moon using this particular encounter and set of maneuvers, which would put me at just about 89 by 100 in orbit around the moon, around an equatorial orbit around the moon. Now you can do the exact same thing if you're going to set up a series of maneuvers to have an encounter with, say, Eve or Duna or Moho, all those kinds of things. You can set up maneuvers to encounter with the planets. You can set up maneuvers to encounter other vessels if you're trying to do a rendezvous. So the next thing I'm going to do is show you how to look at a rendezvous, and in order to do that I'm going to have to launch a second craft. So please pardon me while I set up the second craft. So here we have two crafts orbiting Kerbin. One has a periapsis of 98 kilometers and an apoapsis of 210, and the other craft is orbiting here. We can set as our target, and we can immediately see that it's got a 204 by 204 because it's the craft we previously circularized with. This is our craft that we're going to attempt to make an encounter with craft 1. I've purposely set it up so that the craft are actually nowhere near each other in orbit, and that we've got one of the absolute worst encounters that we could possibly have to start with, just to give you a demonstration of how you might go about this. So, let's start with the basics. Now, in order to get ourselves to have a nice encounter with craft 1, we're going to want to find a good point for when either our ascending node or descending node is matching to get the inclination right. Now in this case, the inclinations are already matching, so that's not quite the same issue. Now, in this case though, I am going to set it up to go off of the ascending node. And again, I just did add a maneuver node and snapped it in just like that. Now, what we can do is we can try to adjust our encounters here. And you could either push it way out like this until you got the encounter you want, like over here, or you could do something more simplistic by, like, for example, pushing yourself out a little bit radially in one direction or the other. There are a lot of different ways you can adjust your orbit. You're going to have to push and test around to see which one gets you what you want. Make sure you never let your periapsis go below 70K though, because otherwise you're going to have a problem with that as you enter the atmosphere again. But for this example, I'm simply going to take it all the way out so that we're going to come way out and then back in. So now, I'm going to zero out our radial because that was just me showing that. We're going to stick with prograde, and for this case, we're going to try to get this encounter. Now you can see that I've got it so that we're 75 kilometers apart. I'm going to switch it over to 1, and just by tapping that 1, by tapping on 8, I've gotten us down at 264 prograde. Our encounter is 6.9 kilometers. I'm going to actually tap it down to 0.1, and now I can just keep tapping that until we get, so you see how that went, 2.2, 1.6, 2.5. So I'm going to take it down all the way to 0.01, and then I can just tweak this until I can get a better encounter. You'll see that we're just not quite right. My guess is that we're on enough of an inclination that we can adjust that. Yep, see I'm changing our normal, and that's giving us even a closer encounter until there. Our current separation at that point would be 0.2 kilometers. We have a perfect encounter. Now mind you, I'll have to burn a lot of delta V in order to normalize my speed relative to the target because I'm taking my periaps all the way out there. But trying to get a maneuver to get an encounter that precise using tugging on the stock arrows is just something that's going to be nearly impossible. Yes, you can do it, but it's really going to be frustrating. Using precise node and using the quick keys, in a matter of less than a minute, I was able to get it so that our intersection was going to be less than a kilometer, and that the time frame of that was going to be at 1 hour and 7 minutes, and that we never went down below on our periapsis. And I could do all kinds of things. For example, if the arcs were really off, for example, if the normal really had to be adjusted a lot, in this case we had to adjust it by negative 5.7, and these craft seemed to have almost an identical orbit. If I needed to do a much greater change, we could do that. We could easily figure out how to match the inclination with it and then tweak the rest of the numbers so that we got a better encounter. So this makes getting an encounter with another craft so much easier. And the same math basically applies if you're doing a transfer and you don't even have the transfer window working or something like that, and you just want to do it, as I often do, by the brute force method. You can get a craft into a orbit around Kerbal, the star, and then use the exact same mechanics I just used here to try to get an encounter with one of the other planets. And it's the same basic concept. Just tweak your prograde, normal, and radial, and sometimes you'll want to change your time frame to get the node so that you have the encounter. Now, one thing I would like to add before we close this off is that sometimes you need to change your time increment massively. So for example, if I wanted to change our time increment so that my node was over here, for example, I could change it to 100 and use the 1 and 3 keys to try to change it over here. And that's not too hard, right? See, look, we moved our node all the way over here by using increments of 100 and changing the time. But imagine you're trying to do something like that and you're trying to get to Elu. That point, you're actually going to want to revert to grabbing the node, making sure that the white part is highlighted, and just pulling the node around until you've got the time frame you want. Now that may seem a bit crude, and it does mean that we're reverting a bit away from the simplicity of precise node, but it allows you to get into a better location. Now, if you knew the exact time you wanted to do the burn because you'd use transfer window, you could actually type in manually the increment here into the UT window. But if you're just trying to eyeball it like this, that's the best way to do that kind of change. So with all of that explained out, hopefully Precise Node will become a much better tool for you to use in your game and will help you get both moon encounters, planetary encounters, and making it a lot easier to set up a rendezvous with other craft, making it much easier to build space stations or dock two crafts in orbit. This is part of the reason why I love Precise Node, and I hope that me explaining how Precise Node works here really helps some of you out there. I've had a lot of requests for this tutorial, and I really hope that I've covered the basics. If you have any comments, please leave them below, and I'll try to answer any of the questions that you might have. There is a text file that comes with Precise Node when you install it. If you go to your game data folder and you go to the Precise Node folder, there is a file that is called changes.txt. In that, at the top of it, it actually has the default keyboard controls listed at the top of the change command, as well as some other information that might be useful for you if you want to try to do something that's a bit more advanced than what we've covered here. But this should cover the basics of it, and hopefully this helps everyone in the future to make their KSP adventures a bit more enjoyable and allow you to do a bit more exciting things in the future. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial, and I look forward to seeing your comments, and I hope you all have a great time playing Kerbal Space Program. Thank you for watching, and take care everyone. Fly safe.